Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started now. My name is Kate Burgess. I'm the Conservation Manager with NCEL, and we really appreciate you being here today. Before we get started into our content, I wanted to give you a little bit of context about the song that was playing when you joined. It's a tune called Bad Luck Blues by Lightnin' Slim, a blues artist. And he, among some other artists, helped create this genre called swamp blues, which is a type of Louisiana blues that was developed in namely Black communities in Southwest Louisiana in the 1950s. And Lightnin' Slim, that artist, has since been named the king of the Swamp River Blues. And so I don't know about you, but a blues tune about bad luck by the king of a wetland ecosystem felt particularly apt given what we're about to talk about today. And so with that musical foray, I officially welcome you to our post-Sackett What Can States Do webinar, hosted by the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators and Earthjustice. We had just under 250 folks register for this webinar, which to me really shows the level of urgency that many of us are feeling after one of the most and largest judicial rollbacks of environmental protections in US history, as CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory recently put it. I don't need to tell any of you on this webinar that water is life. It comprises nearly 60% of the human body, provides habitat for countless species, is responsible for massive geologic transformations, the carving of canyons, bridges, arches, and we simply would not be here without it. And furthermore, wetlands, which is the ecosystem to which the Sackett v. EPA case refers, have been dubbed Earth's kidneys, responsible for a number of ecosystem services that our panelists will outline in just a few minutes. So put simply, wetlands are critical and everyone deserves access to them and clean water. And so right now, states have the opportunity to play legislative defense in the wake of a decision that really threatens our biodiversity, ourselves included. Right now, nearly half of states use the Clean Water Act definition for waters of the United States, and anything that isn't a water of the United States is now vulnerable to pollution and destruction. So I know moderators literally always say this, but we really do have a phenomenal panel today with nearly a century of combined expertise to share with you about how in the wake of federal rollback, states can step in and fill the void for wetland protection. So I will invite you all to ask questions by dropping them into our Q&A in the chat. And if they're not answered during all four presentations, we'll either get around to them in the end or we'll connect you with our presenters after the webinar. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to our first panelist. Sam, as you pull up your slides, I'll give you a brief introduction about your experience. So our first panelist is Sam Sankar, who is the Senior Vice President for Programs at Earthjustice, which is the nation's largest public interest environmental law firm. He oversees Earthjustice's lawyers and lobbyists and coordinates the organization's overall advocacy strategy on issues ranging from environmental justice, biodiversity protection, and the energy transition. Sam has been working on environmental issues throughout his career, having worked as an engineer at Superfund sites, an attorney in the Justice Department's Environmental Division, a senior executive in charge of environmental compliance at General Electric, and counsel to the Presidential Commission that investigated the Deepwater Horizon spill. And along the way, he's also worked as a welder and a boat captain, quite literally wearing many hats and helmets. Sam also went to law school in what is now called Berkeley Law, clerked for the Ninth Circuit Judge Willie Fletcher, the late Lewis Pollock of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Sam, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Just thumbs up, Kate, that you can hear me. Great. So I wanted to first thank NCEL for inviting this panel, which includes two of us from Earthjustice. I thought I would give you a 1-minute explanation of what Earthjustice is, because we serve as a resource to many folks who are trying to do legal protection of everything from wetlands to species to climate. We have 550 staff, 15 offices, many of them located in your backyards, over 1,000 clients, and we partner a lot with states in litigation. So we're there, and we work in your backyard as well, over 1,000 open matters. We work in state administrative contexts, in state utility commissions, and obviously in state courts as well. So we're out there, we're a resource. We sometimes fly under the radar a little bit because we represent clients. You'll never see Earthjustice versus in a lawsuit because we are the attorneys for a large part of the environmental movement. And obviously we work, as a result, we work with over 1,000 different clients all over the country, many different kinds, including labor groups, social justice groups, consumer rights groups, utility groups, everyone. And again, all over the country. We're based in our original headquarters is in California, so we do a lot of work out of there, but we're also doing work in just about every state. And that, as a result, as Julian will explain, we're pretty familiar with the way wetlands protection works in most states. So with that introduction over with, I want to just jump right into the issue here. So when we're talking about Sackett, we're talking about the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is one of those foundational environmental laws that was passed in the late 60s and early 70s. Unlike some of them, this was passed over Nixon's veto. In general, this piece of legislation, like virtually all of those foundational statutes, was bipartisan, and this was especially bipartisan. President Nixon vetoed it because he thought it was going to be too expensive, but the Senate and the House passed it over his veto. So it's an ambitious law. If you read the opening passages of it, it's intended to restore the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, ambitious goals to eliminate pollution by 1985, and from an era in which administrative law and the belief in agencies was at its zenith, it charges EPA with broad authority and says you need to develop programs to control water pollution. The anchor term of the statute is this phrase navigable waters, because when you're giving all this power out there, you have to also define what it is you're trying to protect. So the whole thing that we're talking about today is this definition of what waters the Clean Water Act protects. And the term of art here is the term navigable waters. And that phrase navigable waters all by itself might conjure up, canoes or barges or whatever. But what's interesting about the Clean Water Act is it defines that term itself pretty broadly by saying the waters of the United States, including the territorial seas. So that legal language has been a football in the courts ever since the adoption of the statute. But we thought that football had been pretty settled for a long time until the court reopened it recently. So that language, waters of the United States, and what it means matters a lot. Again, that is the phrase that defines the reach of the Clean Water Act. During the Trump administration, President Trump and his cronies at the Environmental Protection Agency attempted to change the way the regulatory guidance around that language works, because EPA has the authority to kind of explain what the waters of the United States means in practice. And these are the things they tried to exclude. They tried to exclude certain kinds of wetlands, perennial tributaries. They wanted to exclude ephemeral streams. They wanted to exclude ephemeral streams. Perennial tributaries were going to be okay. And they were trying to do a bunch of things through regulatory processes in order to restrict the reach of the Clean Water Act. And these are regulatory changes that many of us on the public interest litigation side were fighting through litigation. But these were actions by the agency that would have been taken through political, the election of Trump and the political power that he was imposing through the agencies. So what Sackett did, the decision in the Sackett, is it looked at this very same issue through a judicial lens by reinterpreting what the court had said waters of the United States means. And it did it through this case called Sackett versus EPA. So all legal stories are much more interesting if you talk about the actual facts on the ground. So we're going to talk about what this case was actually about. This picture that you see is of this lake, Priest Lake. It's in Idaho. And this is a lake that is large, and it's also a place where there's a lot of residential development of, sort of vacation lake house kinds of things. So the reason why Sackett became important is the navigable waters issue that was one of the major issues about what navigable waters means and what the waters of the United States means is wetlands. And the Sackett case involved wetlands development. So the history of this issue is pretty straightforward. Back in before 1975, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is one of the two agencies that has responsibility for interpreting the Clean Water Act, originally said in the immediate aftermath of the statute, wetlands are not covered. But there was a hue and a cry. Everybody said, hey, wait a minute, no, that's not right. So in 1975, the Army Corps reversed course and wrote some regulations saying the wetlands are covered. In 1977, Congress amended the act in some ways that showed to most of us that it agreed with the Army Corps' interpretation of the statute. And then in 1985, the Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Riverside Bayview, a unanimous decision written by a Republican justice, Justice White, that laid out a fairly broad understanding of the act, that we're trying to protect water, and as a result, you need to protect wetlands. But that decision was important because a lot of developers didn't like it. A lot of private industry were concerned because they said, hey, wetlands, there's a lot of land that's wetlands, and we really would like to fill that in, or we'd like to pollute it. We'd like to develop these areas because for us, this decision is a problem. So for years and years and years, the industry tried to undermine that understanding, among other things, by trying to get Congress to amend the law. Failed over and over and over again. So they turned their attention to the courts. And in a case called Rapanos versus United States in 2006, they got some of the way there. The liberals in that case, the 4 liberals, said, hey, we already decided this issue, question of wetlands protection. We already said in Riverside Bayview that the act covers wetlands, but we saw the beginnings of this shift because we had 4 conservatives at the time who said, no, waters of the United States means something significantly more narrow. It means relatively permanent waters and wetlands with a surface connection. Wetlands that you can't distinguish from the waters, as one justice put it. When you waded out of the water, you wouldn't know when you'd gotten to the land, when you were in the wetlands versus when you were in the water. These are wetlands that are very closely associated. Justice Kennedy understood this a little bit better, and he said, look, I think that the act covers wetlands that have a, quote, significant nexus to covered waters. And that means that they have to significantly affect the integrity of the navigable waterway. So Justice Kennedy's individual opinion turned out to be really important. That's the way we have been doing wetlands protection for almost 20 years, and EPA built regulations around it. And those regulations have been a constant political football, but Rapanos was the state of play. So then come the Sacketts. This is a couple who are trying to develop a piece of land near Priest Lake. And so you see the pictures here, there's this little area of land where they were trying to develop. It's close to Priest Lake, and very much in the groundwater and the water around there are very much related to Priest Lake. And you can see what that actually looks like. So this is a little narrowing of the picture. The Sackett wetlands are right there underneath where those words are. And I tried to color code this so you can see what the view is. Away from the lake, as you're looking away from the lake, that little sort of pinkish arrow, you see this wetland right there. It's water, it's standing water, there's vegetation growing out of it. As you look towards the lake, you do see houses developed. And as you look at the lot itself, this picture was taken during the course of what the Sacketts were trying to do. They were trying to fill it in. There's standing water there as well. But the Sacketts argued throughout that this is not covered by the Clean Water Act, knowing that the conservatives in that Rapanos case would have said, well, we don't think this is covered. So what Sackett says, the Sackett court earlier this year said the Rapanos plurality was correct, as the voting lineup at the court had changed. So instead of Justice Kennedy's opinion being controlling, it's what was at that time Justice Scalia's opinion. We're saying now that navigable waters means only, quote, relatively permanent water bodies that would ordinarily be described as streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes. So that's what navigable waters means. And as a result, the only wetlands that are covered are ones that are indistinguishably part of that water body. So the name of the game is now, like, can you show that a wetland is really very closely related to this permanent water body? What's interesting is that even Justice Kavanaugh, one of the conservatives, stepped off of this. He said, well, this doesn't make sense. Even if you just consider the language of the statute, it doesn't quite make sense for a bunch of technical reasons that aren't going in there. But the upshot of Sackett is this. We're going from a regime in which wetlands that are there's a significant nexus between them and a water body, to one in which you have to be able to show that they're very closely, indistinguishably part of a covered water body. What that actually means on the ground is going to be worked out in the lower courts in the coming years. So, there's still room in what this means, but it means that we have a radical retrenchment of this. I want to go back and highlight, this isn't just about wetlands, because the first part of this decision means navigable waters means something less than it used to mean. And that means that in addition to wetland protection being reduced, what's getting called into question is the status of water bodies that are intermittent, like that stream up at the top left there, which anybody who lives in the West knows that that's not a road. People, when I was growing up in the East, I would have said, that's a road. No, it's an intermittent waterway. When it rains, that's going to turn into water. We're not sure to what extent that's going to be protected in the wake of the Sackett decision. Similarly, water bodies that are ephemeral, lakes that form in seasonally in certain areas, those may not be protected either. We're going to learn that in coming years, and we're going to be litigating that constantly. So the Sackett decision both affects wetlands and contains the seeds for the change of other kinds of water bodies as well. The last thing I wanted to share is there are lots of decisions that the Supreme Court makes that in this world right now where there's people on both sides of it. On wetlands, it's a little different. Most people think that the Clean Water Act should be read broadly. So the Supreme Court is not in line with the larger public on this. This is an area where we think state regulators can make some real political headway. There's a lot that can be done. And with that, I will stand down.
Yes, thank you, Sam, for that helpful overview of how we got here. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Yuan. I am the project manager for sustainable agriculture and water at NCEL, and I will be introducing our next speaker. Next, Brian Vigue will share more about the ecological importance of wetlands and his experience working on wetland policy in Wisconsin. Brian is a freshwater policy director at Audobon Great Lakes and is tasked with driving transformative freshwater policy solutions across the region. Brian has over 20 years of experience in government affairs and policy development. Most recently, he worked as a special initiatives advisor at the Wisconsin Department of Administration. Previously, Brian has also worked in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the Wisconsin State Legislature, various state agencies, the Office of the Governor, and recently at the leading wetland conservation organization in the state, the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. Brian grew up in Green Bay, is a citizen of the Oneida Nation, and currently lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Brian?
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, fantastic. Thanks so much for letting me join you today to talk about, as our previous speaker said, a very timely topic. But first, let me, you heard a little bit about my background. I'm, for the state legislators who are on the call, I'm that staffer that keeps showing up every year with like a different job title, asking you for different things. So I've been around this for a while. And so just been with Audubon Great Lakes for a couple of years, and it's really a great organization. Glad to be here. If it sounds like I'm rushing a little bit, it's because I am. I've got a lot of things I want to share with you, and I'll try my best to fit it into the time that I've been getting. So really what I'm talking about, I'd like to talk about four main points. The first is to cover what wetlands are, what they do and why they're important. The second is for some context about our wetland work. I want to discuss the current state of wetlands in the Great Lakes states that we cover. I want to talk about the negative impacts that can happen when you have wetlands degraded or filled. And last, we got a few ideas that you can use back in your state for wetland protection now that protection is being scaled back. So I think we can go ahead. I think so. That's my contact information. I think that'll be in the material that gets sent out as a follow-up. So I think we can move on to the next one. So as you can see, one of the best things about working for Audubon Great Lakes is our membership. They're really passionate about our issues. They're eager to participate in the process to help all of you policymakers do what's right for birds. We've got over 200,000 active members just in the Great Lakes region alone. We're interested in what's happening in the capital. And no matter what state you're in, we've got some members fired up to protect birds. Okay, I think we can move. Next slide. So one of the things that we're an organization based on science. And one of the things that's important to us is dealing with climate change and its impact on birds. Audubon's released a study last year, I believe, that took 140 million observations from birders and scientists to look at where 604 North American bird species live today. Then they use the latest climate models to project how that species range will shift as climate change and other human impacts advance across the continent. And the news is not great. Birds are clearly going to be forced to relocate to find better homes, and they may not survive. So what we found is that 2/3 of North American bird species, 389 out of 604 species, are at risk of extinction because of climate change. Now, that's terrible, but the good news is that our science also shows that if we take action now, we can really help improve the chances for those 76% of species that are at risk. I think we can go ahead. So just to give you a sense of, so here's where we work. This region of the country is very important for migratory birds. We do a lot of coastal wetland restoration work on our conservation side. You can see that the areas where we work line up pretty heavily with waters that have seen some heavy industrial use. And the main goal of our restoration is to make sure that we're providing habitat that can protect birds throughout their life cycle. So while our conservation work focuses largely on coastal wetlands, our policy work extends to protecting wetlands in each state's interior. So I know there's different levels of wetland literacy among folks in the audience. So what I want to do there's a quick explainer video that I'd like to play from our good friends at the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, a group that punches way above its weight in the wetland policy world. So here's a short video giving you the basics about wetlands. Oh, we might be having some problem with the sound.
Here, let me try. Could you hear that okay, Brian?
Can't hear it.
Okay, I'll try sharing one more time.
Okay.
With this. Here we go. Let's try this.
Okay, not a problem. I'll go ahead and just give the brief explainer. And if we can go on to the next slide. All right, so wetlands are really the space between where it's always wet and where it's always dry. And I think one thing that a lot of legislators who are on the call, a lot of things your colleagues might not know a lot about what actually wetlands do. I think they probably think of the mosquitoes and just a lot of unpleasant things, but wetlands are incredibly useful. So wetlands can hold about 1 million to 1.5 million gallons of water per acre, which helps you hold on to a lot of flood water, mitigates a lot of flood damages. If you want a sense of how much water that is, just picture your sort of average water tower in town. That water tower can probably hold about 1 million gallons of water. And so the value in wetlands is, not just the wetland depression itself that holds onto the water, but so does all the vegetation in and around the wetland. Picture a wetland in a wooded setting. A medium-sized tree, I guess we can just call it that, can hold about 2,300 gallons of water. So when you add up the vegetation, you add up the floodplain, you add up the water carrying capacity of the wetlands, you're going to get a lot of water storage gallon for gallon as your wetlands get bigger. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So obviously, I've mentioned it before, but wetlands provide a fantastic habitat for birds, fish, and wildlife that depend on the wetlands for their survival. Up to 1/2 of North American bird species nest or feed in wetlands. Nearly half of the federally threatened and endangered species need wetlands for their survival. Various marine fish and shellfish, various birds and mammals need coastal wetlands to survive. A lot of the commercial fish that people can catch and enjoy breed and raise their young in coastal marshes. Shrimp, oysters, clams, blue and Dungeness crabs. That also makes me think of when I lived in DC and used to eat at Cantlers on Chesapeake Bay and crabs. They need coastal wetlands for food, shelter, and for breeding grounds. I think we can move on to the next slide. So wetlands clean our water and store carbon from being released into the atmosphere. So Water filtration is obviously pretty important as wetland surveys and carbon sink. Okay, I think we can jump to the next one. So just to give you some context for what we're working with, Wisconsin and Michigan have lost about half of their natural wetlands since European settlement. And it's caused a lot of flooding and pollution problems. In the last 10 years, Wisconsin suffered about $365 million in property damage due to flooding. Michigan has 3,000 miles of coastline, and the Wetlands Service filters for 20,000 acres of watersheds. And that helps clean the water which goes into our Great Lakes. But I think everybody has probably heard, a few times, Michigan faces a huge challenge with harmful algal blooms caused by runoff from ag fields in Lake Erie. And so, wetlands could be a good solution for that. I think we can go to the next. So one thing that was really critical to us, really moving the ball forward in Madison and here in Wisconsin on wetland issues, was really expanding the scope of the coalition that we use. So we had the traditional green organizations, us included, but we also worked with a lot of hook and bullet organizations, Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, the Wildlife Federations. And we really wanted to bring people into the coalition that hadn't been part of wetland advocacy before. Industries that some of the people didn't even think they had a stake in the wetland fight. Just as an example, the trucking industry, there's a lot of it depends on the quality of the roads, how much it costs you to run per mile. Damage to vehicles and delays is a big deal. If you lose flooding in a particular, or wetlands in a particular area, and you have an increase in the flooding, that's going to degrade your roads. The vast majority of agricultural commerce begins on local roads. Destroyed roads in rural areas can make agribusiness unprofitable. They don't even have to be destroyed to have a negative impact. Degrading roads from flooding can mean increased weight limits on rural roads and bridges, and that just increases the distance of time farmers have to go to get to their field. Flooding can make shipping more difficult in ports. The insurance industry, the flooding and damage that comes along with degraded infrastructure. It's a big deal, and I think a lot of these folks didn't realize that they do have a stake in wetlands being abundant on the landscape, and I think that's something in each of their states is some low-hanging fruit for wetland advocates to take advantage of. I think we can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, jump one more ahead, please, Angela. So just so you see, what was the impetus for good wetland policy being developed in Wisconsin was a 2016 storm that hit northern Wisconsin. One of the worst that people have seen in a long, long time. Storm stalled over the region. It dropped 8 to even 14 inches of rain in some parts of the region over an 8-hour period, a 1,000-year storm. Communities inaccessible for days, and it took the state really by surprise, just the extent of the damage. It really smashed the region's infrastructure. So we can move forward, Angela. Just take a look at the public infrastructure. This is a picture of one of the roads that was washed away, or one of the bridges that was washed away up in northern Wisconsin. When you hear a bridge was washed away, or I guess it doesn't convey the extent of the damage that can be done when you don't have wetlands sort of helping to control and mitigate flooding in your region. You see, the only thing that's left of the bridge is just the box culvert that's sitting on the floor of on the stream bed, in the riverbed. That's a tremendous amount of money that's going to take to repair that rural areas just do not have. It makes it more difficult for commerce to take place. There's a great picture, and I got to find it, where it's similar to this picture, where there's a milk truck on one side, and there's a milk truck on the other side, and they ran a pump across the missing bridge because it was cheaper just to pump the milk from one truck to the other than it was to take the huge detour in these rural areas that it takes. So now you can see the implications and the effects of public infrastructure being damaged are huge. Let's try the next one. Here you can see this is a picture from Bayfield County, the place where one of the storms took place. This is Saxon Harbor and Marina, which kind of represents a lot of the summer tourism industry up there. And that was obviously heavily damaged. A lot of it was destroyed and unusable. I think it's a major, something like this has a huge impact in a place like Bayfield in northern Wisconsin, because a lot of their funding that comes in to the region happens over the tourism months. And so having something like this happen, not protecting your infrastructure, if you can, with wetlands, it's going to lead to more of this as you have more precipitation and snowmelt and things happening because of climate change. I think we can go through the vulnerable communities. We don't need to watch the video. And I'll just mention the Bad River tribe of Chippewa Indians is located in the region that was hit really hard by the storm. And they were isolated, and it's in every sense of the word. I mean, they had to bring in a helicopter to fly tribal members out who had to go and do critical medical visits. They had to go out for, I think for most of it, it was for dialysis. But, in every community, really, it's the communities that have suffered from disinvestment in their water infrastructure that get hurt the worst. When other communities that can afford to have a political voice and can afford to move policy easier than those other communities can, and they need to get rid of excess water, what are they going to do? They're going to dump it where people don't want it. And unfortunately, it's just a reality that a lot of times people of color and, again, our vulnerable communities are the ones that get impacted the most. It's something that can be addressed policy-wise through green infrastructure. So I've only got a few minutes left, but just want to tell you, getting to what we've found working up here is that with enough education and enough sort of communicating with your colleagues in the legislature, you point out wetland services and you talk about the return on investment that you get, the things that wetlands do, the services that they provide are actually, they're worth investing in. So, for example, the Michigan State Legislature approved $10 million in ARPA funding earlier this year for wetland restoration work. The state legislature in Michigan, if anyone's on from Michigan State Legislature, thank you so much, approved $2 million in a line item for regular wetland conservation work. It's a huge investment in wetlands. Angela, I think we can jump to the next one. There's a program, or actually one more, I think. A program that I think would really go well in really any state with really any landscape is one that we're almost got across the finish line here in Wisconsin. It's a grant program that provides funding to communities that have been repeatedly hit by flooding. It provides them the funding to go ahead and actually do hydrologic studies to figure out exactly how the water's moving and where it's coming from and how it's flooding. And then after that's complete, it can provide them money to help them go and actually do the earth moving and to be able to create some wetlands to help that flood mitigation. And so that's turned out to be very popular. I think I'm running down on the last minute here. So there's going to be some follow-up with some resources that you'll get. Elaborate a little bit more about what I've been talking about. One of the things that I want to include and really praise is a study that was done by the Environmental Law Institute that can let policymakers, let you and your staff know different angles that you can take to advance wetland protection without necessarily having to get a statute changed or go through the whole legislative process. So very creative ideas, fantastic document from the Environmental Law Center, and I'm guessing my time's pretty close to up, so I want to make sure that I thank NCEL for the chance to come speak with you all. We've got some great policy ideas for wetlands. If anybody has any questions, or legislators, I'm happy to love to talk to your staff about some of the work that we're doing if you're interested. So thanks again. A lot of talking, but would love to follow up with anybody who's interested.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian, for all that helpful insight. Our next presenter is Jim Murphy, who will be sharing about specific state policy solutions to protect wetlands. Jim is the Legal Advocacy Director at the National Wildlife Federation, where he advances legal engagement with the judicial, administrative, and legislative branches of government. They aim to protect wildlife with a focus on energy, climate, and water issues, including advancing regulatory solutions to carbon pollution, protecting wildlife from harmful fossil fuel projects, and promoting clean, wildlife-friendly renewable energy. He also serves on several boards, including the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, where he serves as chair, and is chair of the Montpelier Roxbury School District Board of Directors. Jim has an LLM summa cum laude in environmental law from Vermont Law School, a JD from Boston College Law School, and a BA in political science and history from the University of Vermont. Jim?
Great, thanks, Angela. And assuming everyone can see the screen. I wanted to thank NCEL for the opportunity to present. I'm going to try to be pretty brief here. Also, just Angela did a great job of detailing what NWF is, but NWF is the nation's largest conservation organization. We have affiliates in 52 states and territories, so many of you may be working with some of our affiliates. A lot of them have Wildlife Federation in their name, but many of them don't. We also have several regional offices across the nation, including in the Rocky Mountains, the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, the Northeast, and the Southwest. And again, you may, as state legislators and folks in the states, be working with some of our regional offices as well. I want to talk a little about what the states and localities can do. And what NWF did in June is we got together several of kind of the brightest minds to think about, with the Sackett protections or with Clean Water Act protections really diminished by the Sackett decision, as Sam did a great job of explaining, what are some of the tools that states can immediately do to come in and protect some of these resources. The focus of our project, and we have 5 policy papers, and I'll kind of go through the 5 things we looked at, and there's many more tools out there. Largely had kind of an incentive-based approach, and our reasoning there was that passing something more regulatory is probably a steeper slope in a lot of states. But I want to reiterate that states, and many states do have, as the slide I'm about to get to will show, do have state level protections for wetlands and streams that are vulnerable after the Sackett decision. And regulatory approach is really probably the best way for states to protect the vulnerable resources until we hopefully get a Clean Water Act fix that will restore broad protections as we enjoyed them really up until the Sackett decision, and certainly up until 2001 and the Swank decision, where the Supreme Court started to question the scope of the Clean Water Act. I just want to quickly kind of reiterate what this means for states, just on a high level. The federal protections for up to about 63% of previously protected wetlands and 5 billion miles of streams, or up to 5 billion miles of streams, have likely been removed. So an enormous amount of previously protected waters. The impacts, they hit all across the nation, but they're greatest in places like the Southwest and the Great Plains that have a lot of isolated waters. And they impact states' implementations of Clean Water Act programs like the MPDES permitting program and also the Water Quality Certification Program under 401, as well as other programs. And I want to also reiterate that states that have assumed the Section 402 MPDES program and states that have assumed also the 404 program, which regulates the fill of wetlands and streams, have the ability to regulate more broadly than the Clean Water Act does after Sackett. So that's another immediate tool that states can use to shore up protection. And I also just want to emphasize that, these protections, and Brian touched on this a bit, have enormous costs for states. This summer, I live in Montpelier, Vermont. We lived through some of the worst flooding the city has seen. It's cost a small city of 8,000 people millions of dollars. Brian talked about the example of the trucks pumping milk, not having these resources, which are the filters of our water system. They're the sponges that store floodwaters and prevent flooding. The costs of not protecting these waters, especially with the stresses of climate change, are immense. Here's just a quick map. This is actually courtesy of Earthjustice. Earthjustice did a good job of putting this together. The darker the color gets, the fewer protections states have for wetlands. As you can see, really a good portion of the country, about a little less than half have virtually no protections. Around half have very few protections. Really 2/3 probably have inadequate protections, and there's only really about a third or so of states where they have really strong backstops that kind of give the level of protections that existed pre-Sackett. So states are the ones that are left really vulnerable after Sackett. So the 5 policy levels we looked at, and this was on both a state and a local level. The first was zoning. This is mostly kind of a local fix, but states can certainly come in and have enabling statutes to make zoning easier, to ensure that localities have clear zoning power. They can also provide resources to localities for zoning. But localities have the ability to both put in place zoning provisions that actually require avoidance of impacts to important resources like wetlands, and mitigation when those resources are impacted. They can also incentivize avoidance, for instance, making it easier to build in areas where there aren't wetlands and streams. A challenge with zoning is both resources, but also localities only control so much land, and oftentimes watersheds are broader. But to the extent that localities can put good zoning in place to protect wetlands and incentivize development outside of wetlands, it's a very powerful tool on the local level. Also leveraging state revolving funds. Both the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act have revolving funds. They come in the form of both grants and loans. They allow for a lot of federal, state, and private partnerships to do natural infrastructure protection projects, including focus on wetlands. Oftentimes, these funds have historically been used for gray infrastructure projects. One thing the state could do, and the state really determines how these funds are used. The state can also access more funds because a lot of them require state matching funds. So the more the state puts up, it can put up a little bit of money and get a lot of federal money out. States can determine how the funds are used, and really, I think a good thing to do after Sackett is to shift the focus from gray infrastructure to green infrastructure, to use these funds to strategically shore up protections of wetlands and streams that are important and will benefit states and benefit states' bottom line both ecologically and economically. The Farm Bill and other conservation programs also have a lot of opportunities for states to access funds to protect wetlands. The Swamp Buster program is it hinges the eligibility of certain federal funds to farmers protecting wetland areas. That's been very successful. But there's also funds like the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program that allows funding of conservation easements for wetlands and other resources. Oftentimes, under like the Wetland Reserve Enhancement Program allows states and localities to leverage funds to protect resources. The Conservation Reserve Program is another powerful tool that really allows states to work with farmers, to work with the feds, to ensure that that marginal land is brought out of protection or out of production and into protection. And then the Regional Conservation Partnership Plan is a great way for states to get USDA assistance to set up conservation programs, and also education of farmers as to how they can implement practices that have less impact on wetlands. So a lot of opportunities here to really work with farmers and ensure that that the production that occurs is much more productive, and that marginal production can be phased out, and some of that land can be brought into protection. And these again are all incentive-based programs. Tax credits and conservation easement reform and programs are another excellent way. Here states can ensure that their states credits to incentivize conservation easements. Transferable credits are oftentimes more attractive because they have more value and can be passed among landowners. And incentivizing wetland conservation and stream conservation by increasing the credit value for that type of conservation. So this is a way that you as state legislators can get people to voluntarily protect important wetland resources, and oftentimes put them into easements that give those resources more or less permanent protection. The final thing we looked at was ballot or bond initiatives. And these would be a statewide ballot that would ask for some sort of funding source to be created to essentially create a statewide preservation trust fund. It can be property taxes, it can be sales taxes, it could be a government bond. But all of these, not all states have this available. States can obviously create the availability, although in some states that's complicated, but where it is available, this is a good tool to again preserve and protect wetlands. And even if it's not available at the state level, this is something localities can do. So these are some of the tools we looked at. I believe Angela is going to make all of these policy papers available in the next newsletter. And we are hopefully going to be putting out kind of more papers along these lines as we delve into more tools. So again, thanks to NCEL for the opportunity to talk about these, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Thanks, Jim. And yes, we will be sending all of these resources out in addition to all of the answers to the questions that we don't have time to answer, but I know our panelists are jumping on the Q&A to answer live. With that, we'll introduce our final panelist, Julian Gonzalez. Julian serves as the Senior Legislative Counsel for Earthjustice's Healthy Communities team in Washington, D.C., where he's the lead lobbyist on water policy. Julian partners with community members and NGOs across the country to push for laws and regulations ensuring that everyone has access to clean water and ensuring that all of our rivers, streams, and lakes have strong protections from pollution. Before joining Earthjustice, Julian worked for Green Latinos, handling water and oceans policy development, advocacy, and outreach to help ensure Latinx perspectives on water issues were reflected in Washington. Julian, I'll pass it to you.
All right, thank you. Let's share my screen real quick. All right. Do y'all see the slides?
We can.
All right, awesome. I know we only got 10 minutes, but everybody who presented before me was really amazing and even covered some of what I was going to cover. So we can go a little quicker through the beginning of my slides. Okay. Jim talked a lot about what all of this means for states, right? Some of this kind of goes without saying, so I'll go through these bullets really quickly. We've talked a lot about flooding and the damage to water quality that can result from increased development and increased pollution. Something that has been a little less discussed is the changes in quantity of water. Brian talked about what happens when there's too much water in certain communities, but the opposite is also going to be true more frequently because of Sackett. In the arid parts of the country in the West and the Southwest, where a lot of those ephemeral streams that Sam mentioned are more likely to be developed because they have less protections from EPA. When those ephemeral streams get developed, that has a really big impact on groundwater storage and aquifer storage. That ephemeral water that comes from seasonal rain or from snowmelt from mountains in places like Tucson, Arizona, is really important for water quantity in the West. And, you know, that issue is only getting worse with increased climate change and increased drought and things like that. So as more of those types of perennial and intermittent streams are filled, you're going to see a lot of problems for water storage in the West. The second bullet here, bulldoze and fill first, ask questions later. So after the Trump administration put forth their rule, their regulation that restricted what waters were protected under the Clean Water Act, we saw lots of industry projects just go forth under the assumption that there was no permit needed. And the logic behind that is, as federal regulations are weakened, and as state regulations are also weakened, not as many places need a permit for development. And on top of that, the agencies tasked with enforcement, both at the state and federal level, just don't have the resources to do enforcement everywhere, right? The last administration before this one really slashed EPA's staff and budget, and it still hasn't recovered from that. So you could, if you're an industry developer, you can bulldoze, start developing. And if, you know, an Earthjustice happens to find you, you can say, oh, sorry, we'll go get a permit, or try to fight it out in court. And often those courts are very favorable now due to the kinds of judges where they're anti-environmental in their jurisdictional preference, in their preferences, in their judicial preferences. So you'll get more of that. You'll get less community input into these projects, not just because of the loss of Clean Water Act protections, but also the Clean Water Act often triggers other environmental statutes like the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act. And when you don't have Clean Water Act protections, you have less hooks for those other statutes, which often provide valuable opportunities for communities, elected officials, whoever, to provide input into potentially harmful projects. The last bullet here is pretty straightforward. Depending on where you are in the politics and the context, you may be trying to fight attempts to weaken state statutes or state regulations, or you may be, you know, hashing out the nitty-gritty on ways to have positive legislation. So that the legislative battle really changes depending on where you are. Okay, this is the map that Jim showed, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. If you just Google Earthjustice Wetlands Sackett, this will come up and you can see where your state is. This map is from Amigos Bravos. I saw Rachel Kahn from Amigos Bravos in New Mexico on the participants list. I stole it from them. So thank you, Rachel. But basically, this is a map of New Mexico, and it shows what streams and closed basins are going to be at risk because of this decision. New Mexico is one of those states in the arid Southwest where the vast majority of their waters are losing protections because they are often intermittent and perennial, and they have lots of wetlands as well, which are losing protections. So just wanted to kind of emphasize that. We've been talking a lot about wetlands, but those streams are also in the crosshairs right now in a real way. Okay, so regulatory gaps exposed. What I mean by that is some states designed their state regulatory programs around the idea that EPA was also going to handle the permitting for a lot of these waters and wetlands. And that was a fine arrangement for most of the last few decades. But now that EPA has pulled back what they're responsible, or now that the Supreme Court has pulled back what EPA is responsible for, some states that, to use my hands as a metaphor, that they protected from here up and EPA protected from here down. If EPA's protections are here, now there's this middle area where there's not going to be any protections. And what that means for some states is maybe they have to create a new regulatory program. Maybe they have to figure out if they have the budget to staff a new regulatory program. Maybe they have to see if they have the legal authority. And in a lot of states, that's not even a black or white question. A lot of this gets really nuanced and depends on the particular state agency dynamics and state legislation. So it can get pretty wonky on a state by state level. But there's lots of gaps that are going to be exposed now because of the lessened federal protections. And on top of that, you're going to have some states which attempt to weaken the laws and regulations. A couple quick examples. So in North Carolina, right after Sackett came down from the Supreme Court, they passed legislation, the state legislature in North Carolina, basically saying that North Carolina's agencies couldn't regulate more strictly than the federal regulations at EPA. Now, this is a really common type of regulation in a lot of states. Over 20 states have stuff like this that say you can't be more strict than EPA. And that means, when EPA gets less strict, like they did after Sackett, now the state, by definition, also can't be more stringent than that. So it's not only a matter of passing stronger wetlands protections, but it can also be a matter of getting rid of these roadblocks at the state level, which is actually what Michigan just did. They used to have a law like that on the books, and the state legislature in the last year finally took that off the books. In Indiana, they didn't go that route, but they basically they tried to pass a bill limiting what kinds of wetlands got protection and got funding at the state level. And in Missouri, there was an attempt to clarify legislation, clarify regulation, which is now being met by attempts to roll that back. So there's a lot of different types of legislative fights going on around this issue. So taking action, I'm going to go real fast. I know we got 2 minutes. I'm sorry. So this is the most important slide. So there's a lot of national coalitions made up of big and small groups. One of them is called Clean Water for All, that includes groups like Earthjustice and groups like NWF, but also a lot of smaller, more local and regional groups, river keepers, environmental justice groups. And it's above all a wealth of resources, both technical and legal. If you want to get in touch with people like Brian or Jim who have done research at the state and federal level, we have a lot of those connections. We're plugged into lots of different states where folks have been fighting these legislative battles for years, and they will continue now that Sackett has unfortunately come down. So definitely feel free to get in touch with me or my colleague Christine, who also helps out with this coalition, and we can try to plug you into other folks in your state or in similar states who are getting in on this or have been working on this at the local level with advocates for years. Obviously, a federal solution is really what's needed, no matter how good your state protections are. If the state upstream of you has crappy protections, you're going to be in bed. Your luck is run out, right? You're going to have to be on the hook for paying for more polluted water, for paying more for waste treatment, things like that. So ultimately, we do need to work for a federal solution in Congress. The state work feeds into that, so they're not really separate. The real common thread between them is we need more numbers. We need greater strength politically to achieve this. We need to grow the coalitions like Brian was talking about. We have to bring in folks from bullet and hook organizations, from conservation organizations, from business, from environmental justice coalitions. And the last thing I'll say, this is the last slide. Even though this is all a lot of bad news, there's also some opportunity here. The Supreme Court kind of wiped the floor with previous the previous state of play, right? Sam talked about all these terms, navigable waters, WOTUS, and they're now all buzzwords, but they kind of screwed all that already. So we now moving forward can just talk about wetlands protections, water protections, fighting pollution, things like that. It's much more straightforward right now. And for purposes of messaging and coalition building, that's something that's really helpful. And if you take advantage of that at the state level, I think there's a lot of opportunities to really improve our protections. And there's all of the folks on this call and many of the folks who are joining this webinar are involved in this. So I'm very confident that we can work together and make some real progress on this in the years to come. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you want to get plugged into any of these coalitions or if you have questions, and we'll see what we can do to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you especially to the folks who stayed on a few minutes extra. We have so many questions from all of you, so thank you for your interest and insight. We're going to bring it back to the team, this awesome group of panelists. We'll pull some answers and we'll send out policy options, example legislation at the state and local levels, in addition to lots of other really helpful mapping and visual resources that all of y'all can use in our fight to protect wetlands. So with that, again, thank you. Thanks for all your work, and we'll see you soon.